This is a great monthly series we've been doing for a long time. We're really trying to this year diversify the folks we're bringing in and bring in topics that are of national interest. And of course, we have, I think, one of the seminal figures in nautical archaeology and maritime history with us tonight. He's a friend of the National Maritime Historical Society, and we've been friends for, gosh, almost 30 years now, Jim. And we've actually been co-workers for a lot of that. We worked together at NOAA. We've both been museum directors around North America and have run into each other quite a bit. So I couldn't be more pleased to see his latest publication, or one of his latest publications, Wreck Divers and Archaeologists. It's really an intriguing look at that interaction between professional archaeologists and wreck hunters, wreck finders. These are passionate groups and have a lot of commonalities that really has seen an interesting evolution, let's say, over the last 40, 50 years. So I'm really pleased to welcome Jim, and he can put himself in a little more context there uh, to this story. But thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd, and take it away, Jim.
Thank you, Kathy. It's great to see so many of you here, and it's awesome to also see in this crowd my good friend John Foster, the founding state underwater archaeologist for California, who did so very much back then and continues to do so today for the cause back in my native state. I was born and raised in San Jose, California, and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that, of course, led to my love of the sea, as well as joining the National Park Service back in those days, right on the occasion, literally practically to the day, when construction work struck the buried ship Niantic, a former China trader and whaler, which was buried at the foot of Clay and Sansom Streets, having been deposited there in August of 1849 during the California Gold Rush. That transformed my entire life, that find, because it inspired me as a young budding archaeologist to switch more powerfully into the maritime world. And I haven't looked back since. But again, acknowledging John, I think the most important lesson I've learned through the 53 years I've been working as an archaeologist is that you only get by on the kindness and the forgiveness and the friendship of those that you work with. So with that, I'm going to start by talking a bit about this incredible site and what our good friend Tom Layton has done with it. And with that, what I need to point out is that I was invited to be a co-author, but this is Tom Layton's book, very much so and very powerfully. And as you'll see, it reflects Tom's ongoing interaction with this story, as well as his own powerful connections to archaeology. But I also need to point out that so much of this book involves the first-person narratives of both wreck divers and archaeologists, John and myself here tonight being two of those, and probably others if I looked at the full list, whose lives were interconnected, not only by this shipwreck, but by our love of diving, by our love of shipwrecks themselves, and our love of history. And I think perhaps one of the most profound lessons that I've ever learned in my life came through my interactions with Tom before even working on this book with the Frolic Project, where you begin to realize that there are less degrees of separation than we would like to think. And in particular, while some of us became archaeologists and others became wreck divers, we really were sisters and brothers. And I'll get to that. The book, written by Tom in areas with his wife Mabel, is a powerful testament to what I've just talked about, but also to Tom's own persistence in this story. Tom would have joined us tonight, but could not, and so I feel particularly privileged to be able to not speak on Tom's behalf, but to at least represent the book that I was so graciously invited to participate in. Our story begins, in one sense, during the California Gold Rush in June of 1850. The gold rush has been going on now for over a year. Hundreds of ships have arrived in San Francisco, which has gradually emerged as the great new port on the Pacific. And much of the folks that are becoming new Californians include the Chinese. But what's also powerful is that San Francisco, as a great port, is also bringing ships from around the world, not only bringing ardent gold seekers, they're also bringing goods to feed the economy and also just literally feed the miners, provide the equipment, provide the goods to not only build up the mining towns and settlements in the Sierra Nevadas and along the rivers, but also in San Francisco itself, which has blossomed from a small community of a few hundred to the 12th largest city in North America. And in this context, in this tiny little cove, about 100 miles north of San Francisco, on June 25th, 1850, the clipper brig Frolic runs ashore due to a navigational error that its captain, Edward Horatio Faucon, could only attribute not to a faulty chronometer, but to the fact that there was an essential navigational error in the 1793 charts of Captain George Vancouver, who had earlier charted the coast. Frolic sails in, not on a dark and stormy night, but certainly in an evening, crashes into this cove, and as the waves begin to break over it, Faucon and his crew take to the boats. No one dies, but having taken their navigational instruments, the ship's log, and a few personal belongings, they abandon Frolic and make their way in an open boat voyage down the coast into the Golden Gate and into San Francisco, where the news spreads. It's a small item. Ships are wrecking rather regularly on the voyage to California. But what's important is that this inspires a trip north by would-be salvagers to seek the valuable China trade cargo that Frolic was going to be delivering to San Francisco merchants. This includes porcelains. It includes a variety of things. It includes prefabricated wooden houses built by the Chinese to help with the housing shortage in San Francisco and in the mines, but it also includes rare silks and other goods. They arrive to find that the ship is broken up and the nearby tribes have gathered a few items, which they see, large pots and some silks wrapped around native women. And they realize there's nothing much to save, but they do notice the large trees in this area, and this gives rise to what will become a burgeoning lumber industry on the coast, with San Francisco as the great center of that, logging both the redwoods as well as the Douglas fir trees that cover that coastline. With that, the story is basically forgotten. Fast forward to the 1980s when Tom Layton, shown here on the beach amidst students, is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at San Jose State University, one of my alma maters, is working in the hills above Mendocino, California, at a site called Three Chop Village. This is a Cachayapomo site occupied from prehistoric times through the Spanish and the Mexican periods and up through the Gold Rush and beyond. And in this excavation at Three Chop, Tom begins to find artifacts of European manufacture which have been modified by the native people, including bottle glass, which has been modified into scrapers as well as projectile points. But Tom also starts to find fragments of Chinese porcelain. Porcelain, which in some cases, and you see that little rounded one there, they were attempting to manufacture beads as they ordinarily would with clam or other shell, but now with this porcelain, but it's too dense and too hard, and so they've abandoned them. This leads Tom, because he's that kind of scholar, into a lengthy quest to find out more. Was there a ship? And he begins to talk to the locals who say, yes, we think there was a Chinese junk that came ashore. That excites Tom because we know that Asian contact with the coast of North America was not only probable, but that Japanese ships, particularly after the introduction of new rules with the Bakufu, or the leaders of Japan, to limit foreign contact, these ships, purposely made to not be navigable, caught in storms, would be drifting across and onto the Pacific coast. And there are well-known accounts of finding ships full of the dead, as well as ships crashing ashore, some with dead, some alive, from the coast of British Columbia on down at least through Oregon. Was this one of them? But no, what Tom ultimately realizes is that this is a much later wreck. How does he determine this? Because he begins to talk not to other historians, but other than one local historian, Richard Tooker, who volunteers at the San Francisco Maritime Museum, who suggested he talk to some of the local divers. And the divers tell a fascinating story. The story they tell clearly suggests that this is not a Chinese wreck, but a more modern wreck. That is a 19th century wreck. And what we now know is that what the Kashaya were harvesting was the cargo from Frolic. When Frolic crashed ashore, they were literally seeing this in their own front yard. And so they began gathering these various items, as the folks who came up to try to salvage would later find. These are painting pictures, by the way, that Tom had commissioned for one of his books that he did on Frolic. And I think it gives you a pretty fair sense of what it must have been like for these people. It's almost as if the armored car from the bank crashed in front of your house, and you had an opportunity, because nobody else was going to get to it, to help yourself. So with this, what the wreck divers ultimately revealed to Tom is that they've been diving on this for years, and they have a pretty darn good sense of what it is, because they've read the San Francisco Daily Alta California account that suggests that the brig Frolic wrecked there. But what's Frolic? What's its story? How does this relate to everything else? And how do all of these artifacts that they've collected, such as this picture that one of these guys took through their dives, what do they say? Now let's back up for a second. Actually, I'm going to back up more than a second, bear with me, to say that many of these wreck divers attempted to contact people they thought might be interested. They talked to the San Francisco Maritime Museum. Those folks were great. The curator, Harlan Soten, had an interest in shipwrecks, but the director, Carl Kortum, a great figure in maritime preservation, could care less about shipwrecks. He was interested in saving the real thing, like the ship Balclutha, the schooner C.A. Thayer, and others. He had no interest. Archaeologists they contacted had no interest, because we're talking about the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And it's not until the 80s that John Foster shows up with California State Parks as the first state underwater archaeologist. And I also appear on the scene as a young archaeologist and historian for the National Park Service on the coast. These wreck divers just really hadn't been listened to. They were ignored, so they went and did their thing. Now, the 80s were an interesting time as well, because as John and I both were there in California, at the same time, other than wreck divers, there was an interest in salvaging shipwrecks, particularly from the California gold rush, that might have gold. There were other wrecks that were actively being salvaged from. And I'm just going to say here and now, as I do in the book, that as a younger archaeologist fired up with a sense of preservation and protection, I really didn't pay attention to who these folks really were. Now, I did reach out and worked and talked with some of them, but in one occasion, having learned that they'd gone into a national park and a national marine sanctuary and salvaged things from a shipwreck, I initiated a sting operation where we put undercover park rangers with law enforcement authority on a dive charter. And we ended up at the end of that charter because they had openly sailed into the park and the marine sanctuary. The dive master had said, "You're going into protected federal waters. You're not supposed to take anything. If I sound the underwater alarm, that means the rangers have arrived. Leave your things on the bottom." That did not make me or the others in the Park Service or in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration happy. And so many of these people were cited for what they had done, and it ended up in two very long trials in which a number of people either pled guilty and paid a fine or were convicted and paid a fine. And that included federal administrative charges as well as charges in the state. If I were to do it again, I wouldn't do that. But you're a very different person when you're wearing a badge, when you believe in protection of the resources as a ranger or as somebody who cares about these things. And there we are. Some of these folks definitely had an attitude, but then so did we. I wish that we'd been able to talk more, but amazingly, and just to cut to the chase, some of those people that we prosecuted, including Cliff Craft here, and I crack up over the ad that he placed. I know I'm definitely one of the self-serving archaeologists that he's referring to, uh, as he saw it. But what was most amazing with Tom's project was many of these guys that had been involved in the Winfield Scott prosecution had also dived the Frolic, and included a couple of friends of mine. I'm still not great friends with one of those guys, and I will carry that for the rest of my days. And he hadn't ripped off the Winfield Scott in any bad way. Neither had these others. And I also need to say clear and plainly that the museum community had turned them away, the archaeology community had ignored them, and it wasn't until John Foster really started listening to some of these folks. And then as a result of this, I began to listen to some of these folks, that things began to change, but the damage was done. What they recovered was amazing. And frankly, if they hadn't done it, there was no budget for the state to do this. There was no budget for the federal government to do this. The best we could do was prosecute people, that's a failure at the end of the line, if that's all you're left with. Things they recovered included fragments of ivory, which turned out to be carved objects, more of the ceramics, including some of them intact, silver snuff boxes, weapons. Of course, what you sail to lawless California, what are you going to sell? You're going to sell swords, rifles, pistols, etc. But also, amazingly, fragments of what turned out to be the remains of Chinese manufactured prefabricated houses. And here's the strength of who Tom Layton is. Working with others, he realized that this house certainly didn't come on Frolic. It came on another voyage, on another ship, but the exact same type of house based on the fastenings and the fragments, like this piece of a window pane shown here from the Frolic wreck, recovered by the wreck divers, ties back to these early buildings. And one of them is actually in Calaveras County, California, was the first courthouse in 1850. So with that, Tom realized this was a powerful story. Tom, I'll just say it here. When he grabs hold of a project, he grabs hold. And so with that, he didn't write just one book. Wreck Divers and Archaeologists is the fourth in line with books that have been inspired by Tom's work on the Frolic. All of these are award winners with the Society for Historical Archaeology and with the Society of California Archaeology, starting with Voyage of the Frolic to an analysis of the cargo, to the other Dixwells, which tells the story of one of these guys involved in the Frolic story back in China, who had a Chinese son based on his liaison with a Chinese woman that he brought back home to Massachusetts. Like I said, Tom gets into this. But what Tom also did was working with the wreck diver collections which we as the federal government said we would not take, by the way, because we felt that it was ostensibly looted and it violated our rules, which I think was a mistake. But instead, they went to local county historical societies, and particularly the Kelly House in Mendocino. And there, an exhibition was mounted, which ultimately would move and then be featured in the San Francisco Maritime Museum, which had then become part of the National Park Service's San Francisco Maritime National Historic Park. The voyage of Frolic was a success. And to this day, they still exhibit artifacts from Frolic. But what it also inspired, in addition to the traveling exhibits, was local folks who saw this as their history. You see Tom there, a younger version of Tom. We both were younger then. What he's holding is you might recall the scrapers and the projectile points made of bottle glass. It's from ale bottles. So based on what they figured might be the right recipe for ale of about 1850, local brewers, we are talking about the California coast after all, they do make a pretty good beer and ale as well as wine. That's Frolic Shipwreck Ale, which sold out, and they keep moving with it. So Frolic inspired that, but what it also inspired was, and just to tell a little story, Richard Everett, who was the curator of San Francisco Maritime National Historic, the exhibits curator, and I were invited down to San Jose State University to look at all of the artifacts. And our job was to say, yeah, that's a marlin spike, that's a block, that's a ship's fastener. But in the midst of all of this, I don't know what ever inspired us, but we picked up one of the artifacts and started speaking in another voice, saying, as archaeologists are wont to do, oh, I remember when we made these and we fired these, and they were for that crazy new market in San Francisco too. When this thing crashed ashore, we saw these, they were broken. We thought they looked like shells, but no, they're too hard to make a bead out of. I remember this cargo, I paid for it. I got it cheap. I knew I'd make a big fortune on it in San Francisco, but then we wrecked. I've just dug in this pit and I found this. What is that? Sandy Metzler, who is an exceptionally talented interpreter, said, that's what we got to do. With a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and bless them, she created a Chautauqua-style presentation called Voices from the Frolic and Beyond, with actors portraying the archaeologist, Tom Layton, a native person who you see there is Linda Noel, who is indigenous and comes from the area, and others who represented Faucon, the Chinese manufacturer of the ceramics and the rest. And with that, they passed this one piece of porcelain from the wreck around and were inspired to tell that story. It was a particularly powerful thing. And as you can see, not only there locally at the park up on the coast, but also at the Pomo Cultural Center that is presented to the indigenous community. But importantly as well, what Tom also did is here with a replica of Frolic's ship's pennant are some of the wreck divers. John, you probably recognize Larry Pearson there as well as some of the other guys. But with this, these folks were celebrated for what they did. And I openly and proudly like that. I think it was the right thing to do. Legally, under California state law, they were looters. Morally, they rescued history. They didn't do it the same way we archaeologists would do, but no archaeologist would sit down and talk to them. It wasn't until Foster showed up that started to happen in California. And so it's not even just a no harm, no foul. What this is a recognition of the fact, as we saw, particularly as we compared life stories, thanks to Tom's interviews with us all, that we were all basically the same kind of folks. We'd grown up in in the same time period with some of the same experiences and background. Some of us became wreck divers. Some of us became archaeologists. But to many ways, as I had with other friends, these guys might as well have been my cousins, my brothers, or my sisters. And so with that, what the book does, what we talk about in the book is just that. We talk about the experiences of each and all of us through the oral histories with some context, with images. What I did is I wrote a history, which I'd like to think is an honest history of maritime archaeology and its beginnings in California. And with that, the multiple degrees of Kevin Bacon-like connection, in which so many people from California, be they wreck divers, be they treasure hunters like Mel Fisher, be they archaeologists, most of us started in California. The Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology, today the large group that organizes all of our stuff, was founded in San Francisco. Some of the earliest maritime archaeological projects were in California. That being said, I think what the book probably doesn't say enough of is that as we consider maritime underwater archaeology around the world, and particularly even in the United States, California remains the Rodney Dangerfield of maritime archaeology. The state has not replaced John's position after his retirement. Those were huge shoes to fill, but they needed to try. Budget cuts and the rest did not make that happen, but I think they need to. My position in my park was not refilled by an archaeologist, but by another historian who did wonderful and amazing service. Others served on the coast. With NOAA, interestingly enough and powerfully enough, one of the California wreck divers who participated not in the dives on the Frolic, but on the Winfield Scott, ended up being hired by NOAA and for many years was the West Coast coordinator handling the maritime archaeology for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. And that's Bob Schwemmer, a good friend, who I first encountered as we wrote him a citation for picking up two tiny little nails off the Winfield Scott wreck. Bob did tremendous service on behalf of wrecks and history, and I worked on many projects with him. Again, the line is so close between all of us. Will other projects happen? They are, in fits and starts. There are many other people who have done maritime archaeology in California. There are some that are actively practicing it now. And at the most recent Society for California Archaeology meetings that I just attended in San Bruno, California, more of it is happening. And so that gives me hope, particularly with Dr. Marco Menichetti at San Jose State University picking up that banner, as well as others, Tricia Dodds, and so many other of our colleagues, including younger colleagues. I have hope. But with that hope comes an understanding and an appreciation of the past, and that past honestly shared in this book by Tom, with John and I and many others chiming in, I hope can be an instructive textbook. And in that, the story of California is not unique. It happens everywhere. And so with that, the past isn't just prologue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is really fascinating. Some of the questions that were submitted by people in advance, and John Foster kind of summarized some of what you were talking about. Why, why is California kind of, but behind the curve here? What do you think what is the cause for California not having a professional, not having a university program training people, having one NOAA archaeologist for the whole West Coast? Um, can you pinpoint anything in this evolution that you really spell out, I think really beautifully in the first part of the book, why California might have evolved differently from other places in the country?
Well, we Californians have always been, frontier types and, out there. Um, that being said, that being out there saw some of these early things happen. What's important to remember is, and I'm just going to say, I, of course, have worked with two programs powerfully associated with higher education and maritime archaeology and graduated. My master's came from East Carolina University. We need programs like that, but we don't need them in every state. What I like powerfully is how archaeology that is maritime has been integrated into programs in California's universities, powerfully by Marco at San Jose State, but also at Sonoma State University with Margie Purser and others. Margie's retired. We'll see where it goes. But there are those programs. And there is more happening now at Scripps University. Don Rosolo and others are working. NOAA did replace Bob Schwemmer as a maritime coordinator, but then Elon Musk fired that person. And so for now, there is nobody from NOAA out there. The Park Service does have archaeologists, and in my old park, Peter Gavette, the park archaeologist for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, readily embraces and answers calls to and participates, though not diving, on shipwreck resources in and around Golden Gate National Recreation Area and Point Reyes National Seashore. But part of the problem is, I mean, and then we'll get into, in addition to Scripps, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Part of the problem is that this is not an easy area to dive in. It's tough. When the Park Service decided I would start in this, they sent me to the Presidio San Francisco, where I learned to dive thanks to Master Sergeant Dutch Bowen, and I learned to dive the Army way. And with that, they tried very hard to just kill you, because if you can get through that, you can dive pretty much anywhere. And I'm sure John Foster could remind everybody of a few stories where I came pretty close, given the conditions, whether they're on the coast. Diving the Frolic is like diving in a Maytag at high rinse cycle. Diving in the Sacramento River can be pretty challenging too, with limited visibility. I won't tell any stories on John, but I will say that at one time in a flood stage, diving a gold rush wreck in the river, I got hit by a tree and dragged off that wreck. And all I can say is thank you, Master Sergeant Bowen, for getting out of that. So there's a variety of factors at play here. But part of it too is just it's bureaucratic lassitude. And yet this is the edge of the continent. This is an area that has powerful submerged prehistoric remains tied to the indigenous cultures, and there is active work happening there. This is an area that saw Spanish voyages, Mexican voyages, that saw the gold rush and an active trade. San Francisco was the principal port on the Pacific for over a century, and there are hundreds of shipwrecks out there. So should there be more? Yeah, but it's not been there. And finally, I'll just say that in the most recent project I did, where we were working off the Farallones, I was actually happy not to dive, because as we deployed the underwater robotic vehicle, it suddenly slammed rapidly to the bottom according to its sensors and came up with large bite marks on it. And that was about a day later when we saw a seal, suddenly about half of the seal surface in a gush of red. It's great white shark home. And so, yeah, just saying.
Well, and that, one of the other questions that came in ahead of time was a question about how our technologies for finding, documenting, monitoring wrecks changing. You don't have to have eyeballs on the bottom, to attach to a person the way you used to. How has that technology changed, and how is that affecting this larger conversation about how wrecks are found, documented, and kind of worked into the bigger scheme of history?
Well, first off, let me say there's still a role for divers, particularly in the shallower waters. And I suspect there are still wreck divers that are out there doing their thing. And the one thing I've seen with some of these folks is they may not have the letters behind the name, but they do just as good a job in terms of documenting what they find and recovering it. As I'm fond of saying now, actually, to a number of students, you don't need a PhD to do this. You need to understand and be trained in archaeology. And it's not just technique, it's then perhaps linking it and telling the stories. But I think that that's still happening, and I have no problem with it. But the new technologies are allowing us to map faster. Most recently, with our friends at Ocean Infinity, They were testing their new autonomous underwater vehicles, and these robots are amazing. I used similar type robots to map the Titanic wreck site with colleagues in 2010, and it's so evolved since then. These ROVs now launch in groups. They called it their Armada approach, and they can dive down thousands of feet, and they can mow the lawn going back and forth, synchronizing with each other, taking photographs using high-resolution sonar, and in some cases, the type of sophisticated equipment we use to detect magnetic shifts with a magnetometer that say, hey, big metal wreck or not. And we found the wreck of the USS Stewart, scuttled in 1946, within about 100 square mile search box in an hour and a half. And then we're able to completely document it, not only with high resolution sonar, but dropping a robotic vehicle, an ROV, down to take all sorts of great video and images of it, and to be able to say, oh yeah, that's the Stewart, and lay eyes on it as human beings for the first time since it sank in 46. And this was a fascinating ship with its own history. But with that earlier, back in my NOAA days, we were doing that with Dr. Ballard and his team, as well as the NOAA ships, and looking at other wrecks off the California coast. The technology has evolved. The technology of diving has evolved. The technology of taking our notes and recording these things has evolved. And so it's easier to do. It's faster to do, but it's also not cheap.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you look at some of the 3D modeling that's coming out of these projects, and not only federal or state projects. These are individuals
Yeah.
who are producing imagery that you couldn't even imagine even just 20 years ago. And they're
Yeah.
doing a couple dives.
Yes. And most of them aren't archaeologists. You've got
That's
incredible
correct.
people like Becky Schott
Exactly.
and others who are just, the imagery they're bringing back powerfully conveys a sense of these. One of my favorite books by two friends, Wrecks in the Baltic, of the ghost ships of the Baltic, is one of the most powerful pieces of, I can't even call it literature because it's very few words, it's images and some context. It's just amazing. But the 3D stuff, yeah. And with the work that Evan Kovacs and Dave Gallo and others just did, they followed up the work we'd all done together on Titanic in 2010 with this new virtual reality. I strapped myself into a Russian sub and dived Titanic in 2001, much to the dismay of my wife. You don't need to do that now. You see more than I did through that tiny little porthole by actively just engaging with what those folks have done. And we're doing more and more of that. So
Yeah, that's great stuff. We have a few more questions that were submitted ahead of time, but I want to remind folks that if you do have questions, you can type them in the chat, and we'll bring them up here. We want to have at least 5-10 more minutes here, while we have Dr. Delgado here at our disposal here. You mentioned Titanic, and of course, there's always a Titanic question or two. And so, one of the questions is about artifacts from the Titanic. Have you worked with any of those things that have been salvaged, and just your thoughts on how and where those things are being displayed? I mean,
everything
small
that was,
topic.
yeah, no, everything, well, after Titanic was discovered, there were some who felt that it should be left alone, that it was a grave site. And we have seen evidence of the dead. We're not seeing bodies, but we see pairs of shoes, some still laced. We see clothing. We see things of that sort. There will always be controversy as to what that represents, but I've seen enough on other sites, including human remains and other wrecks, that yes, the wreck is a grave site. Does that mean it should not be approached, that it should not be visited, that it should not be documented? No, it's a question of the approach. There's been controversy over the recovery of the artifacts. What I have seen with the artifacts, and I've seen most of them, and I've been to a number of the exhibitions, it connects people to that story in a powerful way. And I'm going to say this as well. Back at one stage, the International Congress of Maritime Museums and the Council of American Maritime Museums, with me as a museum director and a member of both, and sitting on the board of CAM and about to become the president of CAM, but also on the archaeology committee for ICMM, we grappled with the question of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich displaying those artifacts. A group of us were asked to go and audit the recoveries done by the French at Ifremer and RMS Titanic. And Larry Murphy, a staunch friend and a very anti-treasure hunting, wreck diving archaeologist, and I went out and we audited the French. They did it perfectly. They had records of pretty much everything other than a couple of glitches, which we see in archaeological projects too. And ultimately, thanks to the work of the U.S. government's attorneys, particularly Ola Varma and others at NOAA, and thanks to the rulings of the court, everything had to be kept together in one collection. It couldn't just be sold off piece after piece and auctioned off. RMS Titanic kept that entire collection together. They display it, and it connects people to that story in a way that you can't even begin to fathom, pardon the pun, unless you're there. And for me, the most powerful artifacts that I've seen have been twofold. One has been that which was picked up floating after the disaster by the ships that went out to recover the dead. And I will always remember, because I forced myself to do it, was, and not everybody gets the opportunity to do this, but I went through the coroner's photographs of every body picked up on the water. Not for gruesome reasons, but again, as a reminder of the humanity. Some of those pictures are now out on the internet. And I'll always remember the shoes of one young baby that was picked up in the water. Again, a reminder of what this represents. It's not just the ship of dreams. It's not just a big accident. This is something that affected families. And when I've had people at my own home at dinner who talk about their grandparents having been there and one woman's grandfather still being down there, it reminds me of why I do archaeology. It's not about things, it's about people. But with that, one of the more powerful sets of artifacts recovered have been some of the personal trunks of people. And in that, what you pack as an immigrant to come to a new land is pretty powerful, and it speaks to who you are. One of the trunks that was recovered belonged to Franz Pullbaum. Pullbaum was a German immigrant who'd come over and settled in the New York City area and was a mechanic working in amusement parks on what today we'd call Ferris wheels. He went back home to Germany and was returning on Titanic as a second-class passenger, as I recall. Pullbaum's trunk, made of leather, was not consumed by marine organisms. When it was opened in the lab and conserved, which RMS Titanic did with everything, and they did a very good job with that, the first item on top of his folded clothes was the still preserved paper declaration of his intent to become a United States citizen, his English-German dictionary, his postcards of where he'd grown up that he'd tied with twine to bring back to show his friends in America, the clothes he was wearing on the ship, as well as his work clothes and his work boots and his tools, because he lived in a boarding house and had to bring that with him, spoke volumes about this man. So my feelings on Titanic are, I don't want to see it raised. I don't want to see it cut up. I think appropriate tourism is fine, as long as you don't go in a carbon fiber sub. And those exhibits do connect people, as I said. Sorry, long answer, but you asked.
No, that's connecting artifacts to the stories and people's personal histories is certainly, I mean, that's the reason to have these things up and to have them be a part of that first person narrative, right?
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And that's next question.
So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about this. What would you recommend to the next generation who want to continue maritime archaeology in California?
Well, years ago, I worked with Clive Cussler, and that man loved to go out and look for shipwrecks, but he also liked the fact that others would too. And we'd did a TV show together for a number of years for National Geographic called The Sea Hunters. And what I liked is the old curmudgeon at the end of each show would say, now it's your turn to get up off that couch, to go into the mountains, the deserts, and the oceans and search for history. There's no finer adventure. So yeah, for those of you that are actually out there doing it, good on you. It's exactly what's needed. There's still work to be done. There's stories to be told. And it doesn't necessarily need to include shipwrecks and diving amidst great white sharks. The maritime story of California includes wrecks on beaches where storms will wash the sand away. And in my city of San Francisco, we had half of a medium clipper show up on the beach, built in 1856, which was an amazing thing to study and document. So there's more of that. What Marco Menichetti and some of his students are doing at San Jose State is looking at the maritime landscape, because ships are connected to ports and to cities, to docks, to other structures. And whether it's a shore whaling station, they just tore down the last shore whaling station on San Francisco Bay not too long ago. But the maritime story is powerful and profound, and it reaches beyond the ships and the shipwrecks. So no matter what you choose and how you choose to do it, that's needed. And ultimately, one of these days, I'm hoping that one of you is, or many of you, are going to pick up the cudgel and continue on at California state parks, in the National Park Service, at NOAA, but also at universities and elsewhere, but also to volunteer. And I'm going to just shout out for Schooners, the volunteer group working on the Sonoma and the Mendocino coast, who are carrying that water, literally, in terms of documenting and diving on the ships there, as well as documenting things like the Maggie Ross in Russian Gulch, which shows up every time it really starts to rain and the river shifts and the skeleton of that vessel is exposed on the sand.
That's a great answer. I mean, just the adventures you can have without necessarily death-defying feats, but just getting into those stories and getting out in the field, right? Whether you're a volunteer, making those connections, it's fantastic. I hope people do that. I've got one last one here, and this is kind of related to, um, you know, what you're talking about with all these different ways to get into this field, and the future of where we're headed. You've worked in federal governments and private nonprofits, and now with Search, where you are now, you're at a private firm, right? So how is working in the private sector different from working in a government agency, for example?
Archaeology is archaeology. And what's been interesting is, I mean, I started actually working in contract archaeology at 14. I got my first paycheck for walking in fields and spotting firecracked rock and chert flakes from prehistoric sites. So contract archaeology has always been there. And the important thing with that is contract or private archaeology. Those are the folks who are brought in advance of a construction project or elsewhere, where thanks to, say, California law, like the California Environmental Quality Act or federal laws, you don't want to suddenly start building something and you start plowing through hundreds of burials. And I remember that growing up in San Jose, where literally my first project was watching a site with over 1,000 burials being churned up with skulls and bones popping out of the ground. And as well, seeing upset tribal members as security guards fought them and pushed them away with billy clubs. And as people clutched fences, were having their fingers broken by those goons. Those laws were enacted to help stop that, to look in advance, and then where something had to continue to do that. Really responsible archaeology happens, and more often than not now, private archaeological firms are being asked, or they by states and others, to step in where there's not somebody. The rules are the same, and actually now private sector, they're like perhaps the largest employers of folks doing this work. And I'll say this about Search, the company I work for. there was no expectation of any pay for it. But when we got a call early on after I joined the company, after leaving NOAA, that a ship had been found in a river that they thought might be the last ship to bring slaves to America, they didn't even blink. They said, go. And to that end, Search ended up getting a very small amount of money and spent a great deal more in donations for us to identify and continue to work on and document for the preservation of Clotilda, which is the last ship known to have brought slaves to America. And some of you may have seen that in documentaries or elsewhere. But there's more than a business mind to private archaeology. Most of the firms and the folks I've met not only have the ethos and the professional ethics, but the care. All of us are nerds who love archaeology in the past and believe in protecting it to the full extent. But that being said, likewise, as a Fed, yes, the number of colleagues that I've worked with, you and others, Kathy, who entered into federal service didn't do so, in my opinion, and I know I didn't, because it represented a paycheck. It was an opportunity to give something back to the country, to help protect resources and to do what we could for it. And 20 years as a Fed, I feel proud of what I was able to do, and particularly as I see some of you on this call that I've interacted with and worked with on some of those projects, Czar. I mean, so yeah.
Hands down, some of the most dedicated people and incredible scientists and researchers you'll ever meet, going above and beyond.
Well, the other part of that is that when I worked at NOAA, not only was I meeting all of you in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, but the Office of Coast Survey,
Yeah.
who are out there every day mapping the coastal waters of this country, because channels change, things silt in. And they're
Yeah.
not just out there doing this to draw a paycheck, they're keeping the commerce flowing by making sure you don't run aground going in and out of harbors. The folks in the fisheries service and the other scientists, the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, all of them there doing something because it had meaning and they did want to give back. And with that, I mean, the amount I learned from my colleagues, where I started to shed my other biases. I used to just think about shipwrecks as an archaeologist, as an historian. And then suddenly, not only did I begin to appreciate them as something to dive on, but then thanks to my colleagues at NOAA, it's like, wait a minute, this is a habitat. I don't need to dig this up because there's a rare species living here. Or why am I going to chop all that coral off? That's beautiful. And coral's dying. So that's the other part of it. And being in the family of the Feds, but I'm sure, with my colleagues who work in the States, the same thing. Just
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah, no, it's a wide field, a much wider one, and that kind of goes to this final comment from Jason Albers, who, in response to what you were saying about maritime archaeology, it's not just diving on shipwrecks, right? It's looking at the indigenous campsites. It's looking at watered over cities. The term we came up with in sanctuaries, right, was that larger maritime landscape, right? But it's true, and it makes these stories make much more sense. It gives you a much deeper and I think more circumspect look at how these communities that we live in got to be the way they are, how we as people got to be the way we are. These things don't happen in a vacuum. It takes the geologists, it takes the researchers in a broad spectrum and the professionals and the volunteers and all of that. So you illustrate that so well in this book, along with all the firsthand accounts that people give. I want to thank you for sharing this with us tonight. And I hope you'll come back and join us. You're one of my favorite storytellers and archaeologists, so we'll keep asking you to come back over and over again. Trust me.
Anything for the National Maritime Historical Society. And for those of you who I can see and recognize, it's good to see all of you. And I send you all the best wishes and hope to connect with many of you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And thank you all for joining us. Of course, this is a monthly series, and we have our next one coming up. Heather, remind me of the date. It's the first Thursday.
Yep, it's the first Thursday, so it's May 1st. And it's
Excellent.
Patrick O'Brien
Patrick
making a
O'Brien.
maritime painting.
Not that Patrick O'Brien, but if you know Patrick O'Brien, the painter, closely related in topic, he does absolutely fantastic artwork, especially around kind of ships of the line and ye olde beautiful wooden square-rigged vessels. And we're having him on because we're partnering with ASMA, which is a marine art group to put on an art exhibition and show in June. So he's going to talk a little bit about his work and ASMA as an organization. And then we'll be following that up with an absolutely fantastic show. So please come and join us. And again, thank you for being with us tonight.
Last shout out. Hi, Judy.
Thank you, everybody.